Hello, welcome to my PSA ECN Because the Internet paper presentation. My name is Ivan Ulises Kentros Klyszcz. I am an international relations doctoral candidate at the University of Tartu in Estonia. I am very excited to share with you today the core framework of my doctoral research at Tartu. This is a 4-year-long project entering now its 3rd year. I thank the PSA and the ECN for organizing this conference and to do so in this innovative, more accessible online format. For me, it has been rewarding to experience this content delivery method for the first time. So, let's get started. My doctoral research is about the international relations of regions under conflict. I examine how regions change, adapt, and implement their external engagement when experiencing an increased level of conflict-related violence. Now, I will start by addressing what I mean by region and external engagement and introduce the key terms used in my research. Then, I will proceed to present an analytical model to understand the impact of conflict for the international relations of regions. Finally, I will present some preliminary observations from the data I have collected so far from the Russian North Caucasus federal regions. Right away, I must introduce the protagonist in this story, what I have been calling the region. I use region as the term to refer to sub-state, territory-bound governments within a country. These entities are administratively midway between the central government and the smaller local administrations. Across the world, regions receive many different names. So, for instance, we have states in the United States of America, estados in my country of origin, Mexico, Maakonad in Estonia, the country where I am based at, provinces in China, autonomías in Spain, and so on. Typically, we do not associate regions with international relations. After all, it is states who have seats at the UN, open embassies abroad, wage war, and enter international treaties. However, regions do engage in international relations. I offer Catalonia in Spain as an example. Catalonia offers a visible case of how a region can engage in international relations. So, we find that the Catalan government has opened several official Catalan representations abroad. It also has an international aid agency, the Catalan Agency for Cooperation and Development. These are some instances of what the literature calls paradiplomacy. This term plays a key role in my research, and it is typically used to refer to the international relations of regions in a broad sense. Paradiplomacy as a field of study originated in the 1960s and 70s, but it was until the late 1980s that the seminal texts in the field were written. However, at that stage, it was assumed that only regions in federal democracies could engage in paradiplomacy. With time, more evidence from non-federations and non-democracies was added to the literature, challenging this previous assumption. Then, new ways to analyze paradiplomacy emerged, such as through the lens of geopolitics and institutional development. My research aims to contribute to the study of paradiplomacy in non-democracies and of paradiplomacy during violent conflict. Thus, my research question is, do the primary motive of paradiplomacy, the institutions concerned with paradiplomacy, and the legal framework for paradiplomacy change after an increase in conflict intensity in a given region? In short, how does violent conflict change paradiplomacy? In order to frame the impact of conflict on paradiplomacy, I used the work of Ivo Duchasek on paradiplomacy decision-making in foreign policy systems. I also follow Manuel Doyan in incorporating the territorial dimension of paradiplomacy into my analysis. This chart illustrates foreign policy systems. The key feature of this model is that it places the decision makers of regions at the center of the process of international action. So, the system of paradiplomacy involves inputs, outputs, processes, and environments. Due to the nature of the case I have selected in my study, I do not go into processes at all here. Inputs for paradiplomacy decision makers may come in the form of bottom-up demands for external action from business people or civil society. It may also come as top-down demands from the country's central government. Outputs in paradiplomacy are those that I mentioned when talking about Catalonia. So, each instance of official interaction with foreign partners may be considered as paradiplomacy. The environment refers to the circumstances that encompass the inputs and outputs for decision makers in paradiplomacy. Generally, the environment is made up of economic and political factors. So, how does conflict disrupt this system? I argue that, as long as the central government has not assumed direct control for crisis management, regional leaders act on the international arena to address conflict. I draw inspiration from Duan in incorporating the territorial dimension of paradiplomacy into this analysis, namely, that regions are embedded in an operational environment made up of political and economic opportunities, geopolitical features, and history. Conflict, as a spatial and temporal phenomenon, makes up part of the operational environment of paradiplomacy. In this sense, conflict is expected to impact the opportunities for paradiplomacy, to alter the geopolitics of paradiplomacy, and to have roots in the region's history. Thus, part of my inquiry involves gathering information on these operational factors, highlighting the impact of conflict onto them. Then, conflict may be seen as an input. Decision makers may see top-down and bottom-up pressure arising from conflict that necessitates international action within the region's capabilities. Paradiplomacy, the output, may be assumed to be responsive to the conflict-stricken environment and inputs. Thus, my data collection is on the output. As conflict intensity increases, I assume that paradiplomacy, the output, will change in one way or another. It may increase or decrease in its intensity, with more or less activities abroad undertaken by the regions. It may also shift in character, from, for instance, primarily economic to political engagements. It may also change the institutional framework through which paradiplomacy is carried out. Thus, for instance, new external relations bodies may be created, or old ones be closed down or changed. To tackle my research question, I focus on the Russian North Caucasus. This part of Russia, composed of various regions, has had a troubled recent history. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, it saw war and high-intensity insurgencies on the ground. My interest is in these four regions in particular. From left to right, it is Kabardino-Balkaria, North Ossetia, Ingushetia, and Dagestan. I focus on their international activities in the first half of the 2010 decade. During that time, the whole North Caucasus was afflicted by an insurgency led by the Imrat Kafkas, Caucasus Emirate, terrorist organization. During the first years of the 2010 decade, Imrat Kafkas expanded its activities from its core in Chechnya and Ingushetia to Dagestan, Kabardino-Balkaria, and North Ossetia. Thus, conflict-related violence increased in these regions, which I take as a proxy of increased conflict intensity. The graph on the left is not very visible, so I have placed the relevant numbers here to the right. These are conflict casualties per year, per region. Only a big drop was registered in Ingushetia and North Ossetia in 2011. Otherwise, as it is visible, conflict-related casualties either increased or stagnated during the 2010 to 2013 period. So, my data collection is focused on two tasks. One, to investigate the operational environment in these four regions, and two, to investigate variants in the paradiplomacy output of these four regions. The first task involved consulting the literature and doing expert interviews. These were carried out in Moscow this March. Currently, I am still in the second task, gathering information on the different instances of paradiplomacy of these four regions. So, what have I found so far? I will describe the very general picture that emerges from my data collection. About the operational environment, the North Caucasus is one of Russia's poorest parts, with regional budgets overwhelmingly composed of federal transfers. Then, the history of the region is one of prolonged colonial warfare. The northern slopes of the Caucasus mountain system were not under full Russian control until the mid-19th century. Resistance against central authorities would continue, in one shape or another, until today. Due to the history of deportations and migration, each one of the regions I am analyzing has sizable diasporas abroad. Finally, the time period concerned was one of thawing relations between Russia and the West, and growing relations between Russia and the Middle East. All these points are reflected, in one way or another, in the ways that paradiplomacy is carried out by my case studies. First, all four regions actively engaged in international relations, conflict notwithstanding. For instance, Ingushetia sustained a more or less steady number of international activities each year from 2010 to 2013. So, the regional governor participated in international gatherings, fairs, met foreign delegations, and traveled abroad on official affairs. Second, top-down pressures to engage international partners were strong, came from Moscow, and drove the regions to adopt a primarily economic orientation in their action abroad. During this period, Moscow adopted a new approach to the North Caucasus, one that emphasized economic development as a way to assuage conflict drivers. It was also important to decrease the dependence of these regions on the federal budget. Moreover, this international economic engagement was primarily done with European firms, which reflects the political opportunity that came from the Western-leaning policy of Moscow at the time. Third, bottom-up pressures were less visible overall, which reflects the authoritarian style of governance in the region. Fourth, when conflict was worse, international organizations became interested and interacted with local authorities. For instance, in Ingushetia, the regional governor met with delegations from the Council of Europe and other human rights organizations many times in the 2010 to 2013 period. So, what can we gather from this? These preliminary observations point to the hypothesis that, indeed, when conflict becomes intensive, the central government drives regions to increase their international activities. The opposite, that central governments may choose to decrease or isolate these regions, does not hold. As this is still a work in progress and focused very much on a few cases inside one country, I expect that some of the observations shared with you here today may change and refine. However, the overall picture is likely to remain the same. That is, that regions under conflict are driven by the central government to increase their international relations. Thank you for joining. I hope you have found this interesting. Do not hesitate to write to me in case you have any comments, questions, suggestions, or criticisms. I look forward to hearing from you. Goodbye.